Well, Shona, it's lovely to see you. I feel like I've seen quite a lot of you, and this is not, a bad way to be, but we've seen quite a lot of each other over the last few weeks. There's been dinners and the lovely surgery that you did at Egg and Co, supporting lots of eggs. So we'll get to that in a wee second because I know there were some really interesting talking points that came out of that. But tell me a bit about why you're a lawyer. Like, I've always wondered, what was a moment in your life that you thought, this is what I'm going to do? I'm going to be a lawyer.
There wasn't one. There just wasn't one. I'm sure some people intentionally go into law. I wanted to be an archaeologist.
Interesting.
And I was the first person in my family to go to university. And my dad says, no, you're going to do something you can actually make a living when you leave university. And I landed up looking at what subjects I was doing, looking at what made sense. And I did law, being told that it would bore me to death. And I think if I hadn't found family law, it might have bored me. Some areas. I did a traineeship involving litigation for 1 year and chamber work, so conveyancing, domestic conveyancing for 1 year. And I don't think I was ever going to be a domestic conveyancer. So I think law is just one of these areas that there are all sorts of different areas suit different people. And I found family, and it's worked quite well over the years. But I didn't sit down one day and think, I'm going to be a lawyer. It just didn't happen.
And do you ever think about how your life would look now if you'd gone into archaeology? Is there money in digging up bones?
I have no idea. I'm still interested in history. I think I'm probably, now that I'm in the latter part of my 50s, I'm a lot happier to be sitting in an office working than I am to be rummaging around in the dirt on some sites. So, I'm not unhappy about the way life worked out.
Well, that's good. That's good. And you said you kind of came across family law. Was there other areas, how did that happen? How as a lawyer did you move was that through different kind of businesses, different law firms, or how do you get to that point that you think, actually, this is the area of the law that I love doing? What is it about family law that you love so much?
I think the route to how you land up in a specialised field varies from person to person. For me, I had a traineeship in a firm that did 1 year in litigation, which included some family, and 1 year in sort of more chamber practice. I started off for the first year and a bit, I did more defender reparation work, so personal injury work, reparation work. That wasn't something that appealed to me. I realised that the family cases that I was doing really did appeal to me, and it fitted. I like talking to people. I like meeting people. I like hearing about their stories and what motivates them. And family law is a sort of wonderful overlap between that and law. So you can use skills that you've learned, you can help people, but you're also getting to engage with folk and finding out what's going on in their lives. So it was an area that suited me. But I know I spent the first few years of my working life in one firm, then a huge chunk in another firm, and I've recently moved again, but constantly doing family throughout that. So,
and let's talk to me about some of the reasons that someone would approach a family lawyer. Like, what are you seeing kind of day to day? Who are the people that you're helping?
A range of people. I think sometimes when people think of family lawyers, they think of divorce lawyers. In the society we now live in, many people never get married. There's all sorts of different family relationships and situations that arise within family relationships, are probably better described as personal relationships. So I will help people set up their relationships. I'll help people when their relationships flounder and they want a bit of guidance, but don't know if their relationship's over, but they just need some guidance. I'll help people at the end of a relationship. Some of the nicer parts, help people bring children into relationships when people are adopting children. There's all sorts of different aspects of family work, which cover a whole spectrum of situations within family. Sometimes it's described as restructuring of family relationships. So either the building or the dismantling at the end, and forming a kind of new way of being together that's not in that intimate personal relationship anymore.
The time that we've spent together and the conversations that we've had, not only with you, but other members of your team, I've noticed that there's a real empathy about the way that you operate. And I know that there's lots of things that you do because you want to support. And I know there's lots of our community that you've supported already. How important do you think it is to have that empathy as a lawyer? Because many would think the two don't always go hand in hand. How do you find that kind of empathy? Does it come naturally to you, and how has it kind of served you in your career?
I think, well, I hope it comes naturally to me. I want to be able to help people. Where there's, I think most family lawyers I know want to be able to help people. It's not the easiest area of law to work in sometimes. So people going into it tend to be motivated by wanting to help people. There is a difficult tension sometimes because you can be empathetic, and I am so sensitive to how difficult a situation people can be going through sometimes. But me sitting empathising and not trying to take a step back and be objective and look and see what will work and help them move forward isn't really going to help that person. So there's a balance. But I think you have to be open to understanding just how difficult most people we see in that first meeting, a situation they're in, and how overwhelming it can be just to have that first conversation. And that, I think, is a feature of most family lawyers that I know.
And how do you you said you can take a step back. Has that taken you quite a long time to be able to do that? Is that something that you have to work on, and, switching off at a weekend or in an evening must be hard?
I think it's something everybody has to work on who works in this field. It's one of the first things I'm sure a lot of trainees get told when they start their traineeship is your job is there to assist somebody. It's to use the law to help people move forward in whatever they're doing. Your client's problem is not your problem. The minute you let it start to become your problem, you're not doing your job properly. I think I'm still working on that a number of years later, because there are some situations where, of course, you feel passionately about because you're working with somebody, you know what they're going through, but you do have to keep revisiting it. And there's a lot of talk now, not when I first started, but there's a lot of talk about peer support and peer supervision. And in law, we don't have, in the main, we don't have any formal way of doing that, but we have a very close-knit community of family lawyers. And there's a lot of support between lawyers for each other about talking through situations that we find difficult, and how we manage it so as we can help our clients. It's that approach of you have to make sure that you're in the right place so as you can help somebody else. But it's a journey, and yes, I'm still having to remind myself from time to time that that's something that I need to do.
Let's go back to what you mentioned about kind of cohabiting. We see a lot of posts in the group about protecting assets. And with the rise in cohabiting, I think it's really important to kind of address, how you do protect what's yours going into a relationship. And also we can talk about, when you're out the other end, how you can kind of claim what's yours. But I guess, if it's such a difficult thing because, I always try and relate it to my own situation. And when we're doing podcasts or conversations like this, it's like, but before you get married or, make sure you fill out this form and, mark what's yours. And it's like, I can't ever imagine doing that, sitting down with husband, boyfriend going, right, before we get married, I would just like to say that sofa is mine and you're not getting your paws on it. There's something really jarring about it, but you will have been in situations, and I'm sure you see people at the other end when they're trying to claim what's theirs, that it would have been such a better situation if they had kind of had those conversations, even tricky as they are at the beginning. Have you seen a rise in people protecting what's theirs, and what's the advice to someone if they are kind of currently maybe living with someone but aren't yet married?
huge amount to come out of that. Okay, so thank you for
Sorry,
that.
I
Thank
was
you
just-
for that multifaceted question. So I think that the first thing is, and it covers whether you're living together with somebody or whether you're getting married, is educate yourself a bit about what that involves, because at that stage in a relationship, you're not wanting to think about bad stuff. In fact, we just couldn't even contemplate it. Most humans can't even contemplate it because everything is fine. So people get married, they're in love, they see the best in each other, and they're frequently, and I know I'm now talking about marriage, not cohabitation, but I'll give it as an example. I'll go back to cohabitation. But you get to the end of a marriage, and then somebody comes in to see me and explaining what the law says, and there is a real shock moment, but where they say, but that's not fair. And it's not really about the law being fair or unfair, it's just what it is. It's the framework that we work with. All sorts of information gets given out before people get married, but they're not told in detail what it means to get married, to basically share your worldly goods with each other properly, irrespective of who's done what within the marriage most of the time, in very simplistic terms. So the reason I mentioned marriage first is that's bad enough when people are getting married, because at least they are taking a decision, so they are actively doing something. So there's an opportunity to think, well, do I want to get married? What's that going to mean? Especially if you're getting married in later life, where you've built up assets, perhaps you've got children from previous relationships. So there's an opportunity to think, okay, well, I'm going to take this next step. I'm getting married. Is that something I want to do? The issue frequently with cohabitation is it tends to happen far more gradually. People might meet, they might keep two houses for a while, they might spend a couple of nights in each other's house, and then gradually something happens. There's not been that same conscious decision that we are changing the nature of our relationship. The highest it gets to is that we only want to pay one mortgage, or we only want to pay one lot of rent. So there's not that same moment in time normally to think, oh, should I be doing anything else about it? And the law in relation to cohabitation changed in 2006, so we're nearly 18, 19 years on from when it changed. And in my experience, people still don't know that if you live together as if you were a married couple, that can bring potential claims at the end of your relationship. So I think if I've got any advice, it would be, if you are going to move in together, think about it. Think about what you want that to mean. And yes, it does make sense to speak to a lawyer about it, to see if you need something called a cohabitation agreement, because even more so than the law in relation to breakdown of marriage, the law in relation to breakdown of cohabitation, which is under review at the moment, but the changes aren't going to be in imminently. So the law in relation to breakdown of cohabitation is pretty woolly, and it's open to interpretation. And whenever that happens, whenever you have a situation where there's discretion on the part of the court, if a court was resolving it, then it makes it difficult for solicitors to resolve matters by way of negotiation, because there are a whole range of outcomes. So it's better to have thought about it in advance. Thought about what you do want to regulate, whether you want to have any rights at the end of the day, or if you do, whether you want them restricted to just one area.
So what do you mean by that? Like, if you want any rights, what does that mean?
Right. When a relationship breaks down and you've been cohabiting, you have the potential to make a claim within a year of the breakdown of cohabitation. So important to remember, there is this 1 year period from the date that you separate, and so often that date of separation can be difficult to identify because people's lives are a bit tricky. They're a bit complicated. It's well, I was away working with, were we separated or weren't we separated? I never came back, but was that period that I was out of the country for 4 weeks working, was that part of the date of separation? So If a cohabitation breaks down, really important that as soon as possible after it breaks down that you do speak to a lawyer, because there's a really tight time limit on potentially making any claim. So when a cohabitation breaks down, you can potentially say that you could look at the moment for a capital sum, so that's a sum of money, to take account of any inequality between economic advantage on one side and disadvantage on the other. So has somebody been advantaged by the relationship?
And what would that be like? What would be an example of
Well,
that?
one example which quite often comes up is that, you've bought a house together, but one person's put in a sum of money as a deposit, sometimes quite a substantial sum of money as a deposit, and the other person hasn't put in anything, but the title's been taken jointly. Now, if you separate and you don't do anything at all, then the title determines the position. So the law surrounding the breakdown of cohabitation is there to help protect people so as they can make a claim in those circumstances. There is also another legal concept, unjust enrichment, which I won't go into today because it's not simple, but there are remedies. That one's not time restricted, but there are remedies. But that's only available in very limited situations. So that's the type of situation, or maybe a really long cohabitation, because now cohabitation has been a feature of so many people's lives that, you've got cohabitations that are longer than a lot of marriages, where somebody's given up work. They've brought up a few children, they've finished their cohabitation, they don't have a career anymore, but the other person does. And the economic disadvantage can be huge because they don't have an income. The assets in these situations very frequently are in the name of the person who was working, particularly houses, etc., because that's how a mortgage can be obtained. They've lost out on pension rights, they've lost out on income. So these are all things that can be considered, but it's not simple and straightforward. So the sooner somebody goes to see a lawyer when a cohabitation breaks down, the better.
And you talked about, it's often women, and I see it in the group, relationships breaking down. The woman's been at home for many, many years, as you said, has kind of given up her career. How do you go about kind of calculating that loss of earnings or that kind of amount that they might be entitled to? Because I'm thinking about, and we saw it yesterday in the group, lots of women who are sitting kind of thinking, I think I need to get out of this relationship or marriage. I don't know how to do it. I don't know what I might be entitled to at the end. So there's lots of kind of questions around that. And I think there's more that I'd like to kind of quickly touch on. But ahead of that, like, what sort of calculation are you doing if someone's sitting down in front of you saying, I've not had a career for 20 years because we brought up 3 kids and the house is in my husband's name and everything's in his name? What the hell do I do?
It varies situation to situation. So you mentioned both cohabitation and marriage. They are very different because if you've been married, your starting point is 50% of everything that's been built up during the marriage. You don't have that same starting point with a cohabitation. But if, for example, somebody has lost a career, then one thing you can do is actually look at employing some sort of employment expert who can actually look at what the impact of that has been, calculate where they would have been, and can quantify it. So it's probably not helpful to go into too much detail about what can and can't be done, because inevitably somebody then latches onto that and thinks, oh, that's the answer in mind, and every case is different.
But there is something
but
there.
There are really, what I would like to do is reassure people is that there are ways of doing this. But one of the reasons that I was stressing how important, particularly in cohabitation, it is to look at this at the outset, is that it can be time consuming and difficult where there is no agreement between a separating couple to try and quantify all of that at the end. In terms of the work that I do, I'm a family law practitioner, I'm also a mediator, And increasingly, I'm seeing mediations that I'm working with on the breakdown of cohabitation, because it's a really sensible way to deal with that, because there are so many grey areas that coming up with a sensible solution that suits both people at the end of a relationship makes sense.
So what does mediation mean? That you're working with both of them to come to an
Yeah.
amicable solution?
When I'm a mediator, so that means I'm not acting for either person that's
Okay.
there. A mediator, in a family mediator in Scotland, is really there in a facilitative role. So it will be meetings based. I would sit in a room with people over how many sessions, sometimes virtually, sometimes in person. And the idea is really to focus a respectful discussion, to try and look for shared interest, to try and come to an agreed solution, which is never perfect for everybody, but that both can live with. And in areas where the law is unclear, it can be a really good way, if there's the right approach on both sides, to try and come to some sort of agreed settlement.
And who would instruct a mediator? Is that one of the law firms that would come to you and say, we've got, how would that kind of, if you're wanting a mediator to be involved, who would call you up?
Sometimes there's referrals coming from solicitors. Sometimes it's from individuals themselves. So I'm a mediator through CAM, which is the solicitors mediator group, and people can go onto the CAM website. They can see who mediators are in their area, and they can then choose somebody that both of them are happy with, and just instruct directly. And a mediator will be in touch and ask for details. Relationship Scotland also offer mediation. There's different mediation organisations throughout the country, but it's a really good way of resolving a number of issues. But you need to have two individuals who are at a stage that, no matter how much hurt is there and how difficult the situation is, are capable of sitting together and being respectful to each other. And that sounds a lot easier than it is. It's pretty hard when you are really hurting, when, especially if there's a sense of betrayal, to sit there and be respectful in those situations. But when it works really well.
I'm going to come on to kind of when it doesn't go so well in a second, but just before I move on, I just wanted to kind of get your quick thoughts on, if there's someone sitting, listening that's been in part of a cohabitation relationship for a while, or been cohabiting for a while, what could they say to their partner, and what are the kind of first steps in working out what belongs to who and putting kind of a sum against it? Because I'm still trying to work out in my head, like, and even, relating it to my situation, how would Lee and I do that? Is it like, oh, I bought that sofa and you pay more to the mortgage, or do you start kind of writing it all down in a notebook about, right, I pay this, you pay that, this is mine, this is yours? How does it?
Everybody deals with these things differently. So I know some people who basically just say at the outset of the relationship, we know what we're doing. We just want to say that we are never going to make any claim in relation to the legislation at all, and we will manage our financial affairs. Now, that's quite a bold thing to do, because especially if you get together when you're younger, because things can happen. You can have children. That might make a huge difference. You could have children with special needs. That might affect one person's career phenomenally, in a way that was not anticipated. But some people do that and just say, no, we want to say right at the outset that this is something that we don't want to do. So every major financial decision we take, we will think about how we want to do it. So if we pay for a holiday, we will think about how we're funding that. If we buy a house, we'll think about how we're funding that and how the title's written. So that kind of approach tends to work better where you have got two individuals who are more in an equal income playing field, and maybe that neither have given up a career, that they're both quite comfortable and confident with where they are. It doesn't fit very well with the situation where and it does happen, where you've effectively got a 30-year relationship and one person's not worked during a lot of that. but they've been at home and they've been looking after children, they've been looking after the house. Sometimes they've been doing other things, and inevitably at the end of that relationship, one person might say, but you've benefited from all this time and not had to work. Of course, there's different types of contributions. They're not just economic contributions. So I think when you're in that relationship, no, you don't keep a book and say who's paid for what. Although I have met people who have done just that, so it's clearly not impossible to do that. But it comes up from time to time that people are actually just so careful with money. I suspect in the way that 2 generations ago, it was quite normal to keep a budget and a housekeeping book and exactly what came in and out. But sometimes people have got records as detailed as that, as to who's paid for what. But that's not normally the approach that you're taking. So what I would say about people who are in a relationship just now, who are not thinking about separating, but listening to this thinking, I didn't even know that this existed. I didn't know that there are these potential claims. Or the opposite is quite often, but I thought I had a claim to half of everything because we've been together. Sometimes it still comes up that, we're common law husband and wife. That's not a thing.
Nothing in Scotland, but it is in England. Is that right?
But I can't talk about, I'm not
right.
English qualified, so I'm not going to start talking about what the position is in England. But it's, but because there is that misinformation out there still, so you get both. I get both coming in, one saying, but no, they're not entitled to anything, and the other side being, but I thought I was entitled to half of everything. So even if you're in a happy relationship and you don't see it going wrong, there is no harm in going and having a conversation with a lawyer, and most lawyers will offer some sort of fixed fee meeting. And over the years, I have done so many of these with people who are never going to separate. They just want to know what the law does say so as they can make informed decisions moving forward in terms of their life. And that there's a lot of sense in that.
Okay, good to know. So when things don't go right, let's talk about that. And I had messaged you yesterday because every Tuesday in the Facebook group, we turn on the ability for women to post anonymously. So they can post, and we limit it to sensitive posts only. So please, no surprise parties and all that sort of thing. It won't be approved. But there's lots that anonymous posting has helped women tackle. And I think there's so much love and care in the community and so much lived experience that it's a day that we can really see what's affecting women right now. Yeah. And there's always so many posts that are needing kind of advice which has a legal kind of spin to it. And the one that I sent you yesterday was one that is really quite common of what we've seen in the group over the last few years. And it is about kind of separating from someone and working out how you know when the time is right to move on. And I think I hear and see so many people saying, I know my marriage is over, but I'm waiting for the kids to move out the house. And you think, well, that's 10 years away. What the hell? And the post I sent yesterday was like, how do you know when your marriage is over? How do you know when it's the right time to walk away and to start afresh? There's kids involved. Is it better to stick together for the sake of the children, or would they resent looking back on 18 years of happy family life only to realise it had all been a lie if your parents separate when you're an adult? You must see this quite a lot. Yeah. There was another one that when I was waiting to speak to you, I thought I'd look back. And another one was, how do I find the strength to end my marriage? So there's a lot of women sitting kind of wondering how to get out of this. I would imagine, and I can see that lots of them are worried about their kids and the impact that's going to have. But I also see some of the comments here, women who have kind of come out the other side. And one comment was, it's much better to have 2 happy homes than 1 unhappy home. What's your experience of kind of seeing women coming to you with questions like this? And what would you say to them? A lot of the nervousness will come from the legal side and the cost implications. what would you say to kind of alleviate a bit of this kind of stress of the unknown that we know many of our audience have?
The fear of the unknown is huge, and it paralyzes us all when we're scared of what might happen. So, it happens a lot. Most people that come to see me, whether they express it or not, are scared of what might happen. And there is a bleak reality of separating, which is not news, but you can't take one household, this is financial rather than in relation to children at the moment, and create two households and leave everybody better off financially. So especially when times are hard and if there's financial worries there already, then that is overwhelming to the extent that many people are just too frightened to do anything about it. So when I was talking about people even in happy relationships going along, taking up one of the kind of fixed fee meetings that are available, or if you're eligible for legal aid, finding a legal aid solicitor who can give you a meeting to talk about these things. That's the first step if you're approaching a solicitor. But once I see people, what I will always say is that I'm going to take some details, and it always feels horribly invasive because I've never met somebody before and I'm suddenly asking them the most intimate details of their life. But I'm taking that in a really confidential way, simply so as I can give them some sort of meaningful advice. What I hope at the end of that meeting is somebody can walk away able to make informed decisions about the future. So as opposed to what, their best friend or their best friend's aunt happened to them, they can make informed decisions. But the other thing that I'll normally say is that my job after this information session is if you know that your marriage has broken down, or your relationship has broken down. I work with people whose relationship's in difficulty all the time, but I am not the right professional to help clients work through whether the relationship has actually broken down. And I have had so many clients that have found it really helpful to work with a counsellor. Sometimes when people's relationships are struggling, they think about couple counselling, and that totally is something which is a valid way forward. But I've had so many clients benefit from working one-to-one with a counsellor to help them process exactly the sorts of thoughts that you're talking about, to try and work out where they are, what's motivating them, and to work out the best way forward, as opposed to sometimes the relationship hasn't broken down. Sometimes people are just going through a really rough time and there will be light at the end of the tunnel. Other times people struggle for years and years and years, always looking for the right moment. And especially when there are children, in my experience, there is no right moment. It'll be the right moment when they go to school, because then, things will be easier. It'll be the right moment when they leave home, because things will be easier. Oh no, it's not the right moment just now because they've got exams before they leave school. Oh no, it's not the right moment because they're about to get married. I think personally, and I'm not a counsellor, personally, I don't think there is ever a right moment. I think there'll always be a challenge to doing something as major as separating. It's about why you want to separate and whether that's the right thing to do.
I think women put themselves, and I'm reading the kind of some of the responses, and it's always so good, when you see, and I know some of the responses maybe from a legal perspective, you might be going, no, that's not the right advice. But, this is one, I've literally just been through the exact same thing. I doubted my decision for years, and now I can hand on heart say it's the best decision I ever made for me and my daughter. It seems daunting, and no, it's not always easy, but you're stronger than you think. Look at the positives and think of you and your child's happiness. You can't live like that forever. Happy mum equals happy child. Don't feel guilty for putting yourself first.
I would agree with that totally. I think as well, it's really important that you find the right people to work with. Now, whether that's the right friend, because sometimes our closest friends aren't necessarily the right people to help support you through a difficult decision. So find the right network, whoever that is, to support you through it. If you're going to look at counselling, find somebody you can work with, because it's not really just you go to the first person that you've been given the name of and think, well, I'm not really that comfortable here. That's not gonna work. Find the right lawyer, because family lawyers in particularly know it's like every other human relationship. It's really important that you're able to work together, that you get on together, that you can trust each other. And if you build that team around you, then it will make the process easier. It will make it a lot easier.
You don't really think about shopping around for a lawyer, do you? When you get to that point, it's often like, okay, who did you use? And it might not be the right one for you.
No, different people.
Mm-hmm.
Different people.
Mm-hmm.
It's, you know, we're all human. We all have things in common. Or it's just that you've not got the connection that you think that you would like to have. So it's not even shopping around. It's just making sure that you are comfortable with whoever you're working with, because it's not just like buying a house where you'll have 2 or 3 emails with the person doing the conveyancing. It's going to be a lot more personal than that. You are going to be sharing intimate details. You are going to need to trust that person so as you can ask them questions about things that are really difficult and they're affecting the most important parts of your life. So just make sure it's somebody that you're comfortable with.
There's some women in the group that need to get out of a relationship. You know, it's not a case of just biding their time until they feel that it's right to move on. There's some that have to get out because of their own safety. And I was reminded of that because a girl commented yesterday, when I asked my abusive ex, why do you hurt me? He replied, probably because I know I can. I finally realised I'd never alter that kind of mindset, but I had a duty to ensure my children didn't form the same one. That's what gave me the power to get him out. I wouldn't allow his behaviour to shape that of my 2 boys. You and your children deserve more. Some people are living in houses that aren't safe.
Some people are living in absolutely horrible situations. And when you are living with somebody whose behaviour is abusive or controlling, statistically, it is so difficult to leave. You know, there's all sorts of terrifying statistics as to how many times you've got to try before you'll actually succeed. Women's Aid are there. They've got huge experience in this area, and they can be approached, and there will be people there that can speak to you and talk you through that type of situation. And from a legal perspective, there are all sorts of remedies that can be used to address different specific areas of abuse. But the real issue, and why the lady you were just talking about sounds incredibly strong, is that it can be so difficult to do that, because normally somebody displaying that type of behaviour has spent years telling their partner how useless they are and how they're not capable of doing anything. And whether it's physical abuse or whether it's, you know, emotional, economic abuse, whether they've had access to funds, they might not be able to go and see a solicitor because they might not be able to leave the house. So I've had situations where people aren't able to access food because it's locked away. They aren't able to access money because it's locked away. They only get their phones in certain circumstances. So I think for all of us, and you're sitting there with your phone just now, and I'm probably criticised for picking up mine far too often, to live like that is just incomprehensible. And I always remember in a domestic abuse training, it was a Women's Aid trainer, but an example that she gave which really stuck with me. It's the things that go on in relationships that the rest of us don't see. And there was a victim who had been in a fire. I can't remember the details, so if you're listening, in terms of the trainer, if I get this slightly wrong, I apologise. But who'd been in a fire when they were younger, and all that the partner had to do is just take out a match. That was it. Nothing else. So you can sit in a crowded room and be committing acts of abuse that are horrific because of the fear that installs on the person. That's all you need to do to control somebody. So I think for most people, no matter how difficult the relationship is, it's difficult to imagine a situation where you're living with that sort of person. So those people really do need support. And yes, legal support, but to have the strength to use that legal support, having some other support in the background, and Women's Aid are fantastic at that. Yes.
And what would Women's Aid do? Like, so someone, because I'm reflecting on lots of posts that we've seen over the years about, as you said, that phone restriction. You know, I need to wait for my partner, my husband, to leave the house before I can kind of call anyone, and I think he's filming me. You know, there's so many horrific cases and incidences. Like, so what would be, and just very quickly, you know, if someone is getting in touch with Women's Aid, what would Women's Aid do? Because I'm thinking about that woman in her house, scared of her husband coming home or not being able to do anything. How do Women's Aid help that?
There's a range of ways that they can help. So there's support workers there, but there are safe houses. They can help literally uplift somebody and their children and put them someplace where their partner doesn't know where they are, while the legal remedies are put in place to protect them. So what I would say is, for somebody that is living in that sort of situation, whatever it is, see if they can have a conversation with them. And the support is there. I'm not saying it's easy. It's not easy, because if you're living in that sort of situation, it's very far from easy. But these situations aren't going to get better. It's not. It's, you know, you're not going to wake up one day and it's suddenly all okay. So
he's not going to change. And some women are saying, you know, I hoped that things would get better and his job would become less stressful, or he would become a different person. But the reality is, they don't change.
Yeah, and if there's children in the house, it's not just you that's been affected by this, it's the children as well. So there's a huge amount of experience out there. There are legal remedies, so the law can help. But it's what I was saying earlier, it's a team of people around you to help you through the situation.
Let's end on something positive.
That's good.
You know, there's probably many, and I hope there's lots of cases of you being involved in happy divorces. Do amicable divorces happen?
Yes.
And what does that look like? How do you have a happy divorce?
Well, I think it's probably wrong to say happy divorce, because nobody goes into marriage thinking it's going to come to an end. So there's always, in my experience, there is always some level of sadness that has happened, because that's not where people thought that they were going to land up. I think when Gwyneth Paltrow and Chris Martin separated, they talked about conscious uncoupling, which was quite a title. But it actually describes a process we use in Scotland. It's called collaborative practice. So I've talked a little bit about mediation. There's a way that people can work together to come up with a solution. Collaborative practice takes bits of mediation and bits of what people normally think of as going to see a solicitor, but again, it's meetings based. And the thing that's really unusual about collaborative practice is that both members of a couple sign up to working together for the benefit of the family, and the solicitors working with them also sign up for that. So it's a different dynamic. So both, as a family lawyer, I work in these various different ways, and it's really interesting the difference in approach and the difference in feel when I'm working as a mediator and when I'm working collaboratively. So I wouldn't go so far as to say happy divorce, but I think in those two methods, and sometimes just in traditional negotiated settlement, you are more likely, especially when there's children, to go from a situation where your relationships come to an end as you knew it, but that you've formed a new type of relationship, a new way of working together really as a team in terms of parenting children going forward. And that's hugely satisfying from a solicitor's point of view, and I think hugely beneficial for the people that have gone through that process, because it means that moving forward they can, without dreading it, go along to graduations and weddings and all the things that are important in life without thinking, oh, I can't believe I'm going to see, or I'm going to see, husband and his new partner and their children. It's more just, it's a far better way of doing it if you can manage it. But there's a whole range of options in terms of process. I'm just leading on to another conversation here because there's a whole range of options as to how people can deal with the process of separating. And what's really important is to find the one that suits the individual at whatever stage they're at. So somebody who might be capable of mediating in a year isn't quite there yet because everything's just too raw. So it's about timing and trying to find the best way forward. So if there are immediate issues that need to be dealt with, mediating in a year is not going to help. If you can have some sort of interim arrangement and then leave it a little bit, then that might well be a way forward.
So be more Chris and Gwyneth, really. Conscious uncoupling.
I'm not sure I would go as far as that, but I think don't be scared to go and talk to a lawyer by thinking, oh, they're just going to have me in court in no time at all. Because whenever I see somebody in that first meeting, I will talk them through the range of options. And it starts with something which we normally call, implementation agreements, where basically somebody comes along, they'll have a chat about what the law says. They'll go away and say, well, we don't want to pay lawyers, we don't want to do this, but we would be happy doing X, Y, and Z. You can go back to a lawyer. You will get an email from the lawyer saying, you realise I can't advise you as to whether this is fair and reasonable, but I understand this is what you want to do. And that can be put into a binding contract. Scotland's got this great system called minutes of agreement, which once they're registered are as binding and enforceable as court decrees. So it gives people power over their own affairs in a way that other parts of the world don't necessarily have. So you don't need to, it doesn't divorce you, but you don't need to go to a court and ask for a consent order. You don't need anybody to rubber stamp anything. It means that the couple can actually decide what happens. So you can literally do it as simply as that. And for some people that is exactly what they do. They come along and say, well, we've decided what we want to do here. Can you please put it into a contract for us? You've got mediation, you've got collaborative practice, you've got just going to a solicitor and chatting to them, maybe the odd meeting, email, etc., and come to a negotiated settlement. All four of those methods don't go anywhere near a court or an external decision maker and can produce really good outcomes. So don't be frightened by what people often say going to a lawyer is about. And there is this image of going to court and fighting, and the minute you go to a solicitor, that it will become far more adversarial. That shouldn't happen. It doesn't normally happen.
That's good to know. So it doesn't have to be too expensive. It doesn't have to be too fraught. You can do a lot of it yourself and keep it, as you said, within your own power.
Yeah, and over expense, talk to the lawyer about expense, because we are human as well. We understand what it feels like to be in that situation. So talk about what can be done to minimise expense if that's something that is really important to you. Because there's no point worrying about these things and not sharing that with the person you're working with. You may as well share it. Talk about what's realistic and what isn't realistic.
Perfect. Shona, thank you very much. We could speak all day about this, and there's loads more cases, unfortunately, like this that we see every day. But I think by having these conversations, by opening up, to what law is, and as you said, divorce doesn't have to be the kind of screaming matches between lawyers. There is a better, a nicer way of doing it. And I know it's not a happy divorce, but it's certainly not the kind of what we've come to kind of think about when we hear about kind of some of the harsher divorces. But thank you so much for your time. I'm sure we will speak again, and thank you for supporting so many of our community already, and thank you for your time.
Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you.